Hello and welcome to another video for Covenant Theology. My name is John. In this particular series, we're looking at dispensationalism. We've looked at the definitions and characteristics of what is a dispensation, but now Charles Ryrie, again, we're referencing his work, Dispensationalism, for kind of our reference. Now he's going to get into what are the essentials or the key tenets of dispensationalism. What's indispensable if you're going to be a dispensationalist? What are the key things you have to be holding to? So even understanding that dispensationalism is somewhat evolving and progressive, these main tenets I think still apply across the board. So the first one he has 4 points. His first one is a negative point, because sometimes when you're trying to define a word or a concept, you first want to say what it isn't. And so his first isn't is that dispensationalism is not necessarily tied to the concept of dispensations. That may sound a little odd, but his reasoning is because so many other schools of thought and interpretation, covenant theology included, we don't dismiss the idea of a dispensation. We believe God works differently with different people in different periods of time, with Moses versus Abraham versus Noah and Adam, even within the nation of Israel formed after obviously Egypt, or even within Egypt. You have that God dealt with them via prophets, via judges, via kings, and so forth. So God worked differently over correspondingly different ages. So because everyone uses the concept, he says, well, then that can't be a distinctive element of dispensationalism. Okay, I agree with that. But an interesting side twist on this is that Ryrie later in the book, or maybe it's earlier in the book, I have to go back and look, but in looking for the historical support of dispensationalism, makes the comment that anybody throughout Christian history and the early church fathers that used the terminology of dispensation, or its like terminology of a management, of an economy, and things like that, he classifies them as pre-dispensationalists. And it's like, well, but if that's not a key element, why would you classify them as dispensationalists when you already agree that other groups, other interpretations, and schools of thought are familiar with and use the term? So that's a little misleading there to try to use this concept positively and negatively for your own benefit. So anyway, dispensationalism, key elements. So that was negatively. So they don't necessarily have it as a key tenet that you have to hold to dispensations. So what are the positive ones? Well, he has three points left, and they're the positive ones. The first is that within dispensational theology, you have to keep Israel and the New Testament church distinct and separate. Just period. That's a main point. So then third, how do you arrive at that? Well, the distinction, he says, between Israel and the church is because of or founded upon their hermeneutic or their interpretive structure called literal interpretation. So the plain reading of the plain words on the paper in front of you, if you read the scriptures that way, you'll just come away with Israel being Israel and the church being the church. So that remains to be seen. That's stated here as fact, but we have yet to prove that out. And that's what I seek to do in these videos as we get into the individual dispensations. We'll go through scripture and see what we find with a plain and normal reading of the text. Now, through a plain and normal rendering reading of the text, it does still allow for there to be typologies, illustrations, apocalyptic versus poetic literature. These things are still allowed to play themselves out. But what he expressly forbids is the idea of spiritualizing or allegorizing a text. So we'll see how that plays out, if Scripture itself allows for that or does that, or if that's something that he's accusing other groups of bringing into the text, clearing or clouding up the plain reading of the words if you spiritualize it into something that's not there. So 2 points. So keep Israel and the church distinct, and their interpretive grid of reading the Bible literally is how you get to that. Well, the fourth point is just that within the basic purposes of God, he in all of his dealings with mankind seeks to glorify himself. And whether that's through salvation, mercy, grace, justice, judgment, all these things are born out to glorify God. So let's critique this a little bit. For number 4, this idea of glorifying God. Again, this is another premise that even probably greater than the first one, negatively stated about dispensations, everybody would agree to. So that's not unique to dispensationalism, that God in all of his dealings with mankind is working to glorify himself. I think that's plain enough. So I would say 4 then is not a key or essential tenet of dispensationalism, because so many other groups already agree to that, already would acknowledge that. So we're left then with points 2 and 3. Keep Israel and the church distinct, and we get to that by reading the Bible literally. So in a sense, for Ryrie, these are the only 2 elements that comprise dispensationalism. He talks about, for covenant theology, we gloss over the text when all we talk about from Genesis 3:15 to the end of Revelation is God working out his purposes within the covenant of grace. So that just glosses over everything. Well, if these are your only 2 main tenets for dispensationalism, that sounds more like glossing over the text if all I'm ever looking for is to keep Israel and the church distinct and separate. What about the period before Israel as a nation even existed? And at what point did they exist as a nation? Are we addressing when Jacob's name is changed to Israel? Are we talking about his children later after the fact? Are we talking about when they become, in a sense, a nation and receive the commandments in Exodus? And under Moses, they sort of lead out on their journeying and wandering towards the promised land coming out of that? Or are we talking about the nation of Israel as it's kind of more commonly understood today as coming out of captivity? So in a sense, not occurring until the book of Matthew. Does that not gloss over more areas of Scripture? And also, I don't understand the division nationalistic context when Jesus is arguing, as he usually did, with the scribes and Pharisees, Sadducees, and others. Their main point to justify, in a sense, their ancestry would usually be to appeal back to Abraham. We are the children of Abraham. Well, that's relational in context, because Abraham is basically, in a sense, not part of the national context of Israel. That's under Jacob. That's, one of his sons that's later down the line. And you could say, well, we could sort of grandfather or great-great-great-grandfather Abraham into that. But again, is that the plain reading of the text? And again, what version of Israel am I supposed to be considering here? So these things aren't exactly borne out for us. We'll have to, as we read and again go through the different dispensations, the ages, see what we find. But we'll have to ask ourselves as we go, what warrant do we have to keep them separate? Because we may find, and I'm going to tip my hat to this, that we will find, that there are times where Israel's terminology for its nation and a holy people and stuff like that, believers, is going to also be applied to the church. So there's going to be a crossover, and we'll have to see how do we deal with that. If Ryrie and other dispensationalists are saying, well, no, you have to keep them separate. Which within their hermeneutical principle, their grid of interpretation, this literary interpretation, that's really what it boils down to, because point 2, keeping Israel and the church distinct, is only valid if we find point number 3 to be true. If reading the Bible in a literal sense, the way they say, if that reading bears that out, then we say, okay, well then point 2 is true. But otherwise, point 3 just kind of stands on its own. I can read the Bible literally, and for the words that are there on the paper, seek to not spiritualize or make analogies out of what's going on in the text, and I still may come away with that Israel and the church are believers under the providence of God in all ages. So we have to see if that bears itself out as true. That has to be the main point of what we're looking for. As, like I said, in the next few videos, I'm actually going to jump into the different dispensations. And we'll look at if that's what we find. Because at its best, dispensational theology hangs entirely then, according to Ryrie, on this principle of a literary interpretation. And if it can be shown as we go through Scripture that a plain and normal rendering of the text and terms ends up equating in any way, shape, or form Israel and the church, believers, God's people, well, then in a sense we could say there's no such thing as dispensationalism. Because that main tenet, that one main tenet, would be proven to be false. So stay tuned. That's what we're going to bear out in these further lessons. So next video in this category, we're going to look at the dispensation of innocence. Adam as created in the garden. We'll see what Ryrie calls his first test, and we'll see how that compares to covenant theology's perspective on Adam's relationship to God under a covenant of works. So stay tuned. God bless you. Thank you for watching. If you like this, like, subscribe, share, all that fun stuff if you feel so inclined. And I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.